The door they sealed beneath Whitechapel. Some doors are locked to keep evil out *, and others are locked to keep it in. Chapter 1: The Discovery Below Whitechapel. The rain had been falling since before anyone in Whitechapel could remember it not falling, or so it seemed to Thomas Greer on that black October morning in 1888. He was a foreman, a thick-armed, broad-shouldered man of 43 who had laid cobblestones and dug drainage channels across half of London's East End, and he had seen roads collapse before. Roads in Whitechapel were always collapsing. The ground beneath them was rotten or old, or simply tired of holding up the weight of a city that cared nothing for what lay beneath. But he had never seen a road collapse like this. It had begun at 4:30 in the morning, while the lamplighters were still at their rounds, and the street sellers had not yet stirred. A section of Galston Street, 40 feet long perhaps, had simply dropped away, swallowed by the earth as neatly as a letter disappearing into a post-box. The collapse left a jagged black mouth in the cobblestones, and from that mouth rose an odour so ancient and so cold that the 3 workers who first arrived on the scene had all taken 3 involuntary steps backward simultaneously, as though the earth itself had exhaled at them. Greer arrived at 6, called out from his lodgings on Commercial Street by a boy who banged on his door with the frantic energy of someone who had been promised a shilling for his trouble. He stood at the edge of the collapsed section with a lantern in one hand and his hat crushed in the other, and he stared down into the darkness below and felt, for the first time in his professional life, that he did not want to know what was down there. "How deep?" he asked the youngest of the workers, a red-haired lad named Fenwick who couldn't have been more than 19. "Don't know, sir," Fenwick said. "We dropped a stone, took a long time to land." Greer crouched at the edge and held the lantern over the hole. The light plunged maybe 20 feet before the darkness simply ate it, swallowed the glow whole, leaving nothing. The walls of the collapse were not dirt and clay, as he would have expected. They were old stone, worked stone, fitted blocks that predated anything Greer had encountered in 40 years of working London's underground. The stone was dark with age, slicked with moisture, and carved, or so it appeared, with faint markings he couldn't make out in the lantern's dancing light. "Right," he said and stood up, and tried to sound as though his heart was not hammering behind his ribs. "Someone go for the police." The police arrived at 7 o'clock in the form of 2 constables, who were both young enough that their moustaches were still making up their minds about existing. They stood at the rim of the collapse and shone their own lanterns into the hole and said very little for a long time. The rain intensified. Somewhere to the north, a church bell rang 7 times, and the sound of it crossed the rooftops of Whitechapel and fell into the hole and was not heard again. By 8 o'clock, a sergeant named Horace Pemberton had arrived. He was a stout, red-faced man who had served in Whitechapel for 14 years and considered himself entirely unshockable. He stood at the edge of the collapse for 30 seconds, then took out a notebook and began writing in it with a short pencil, pausing every few moments to moisten the tip against his tongue. "Any workers gone down?" he asked. "One," Greer said. "Young fellow went down on a rope about an hour ago, said he wanted to see what was there." Pemberton looked up from his notebook and... Greer glanced at Fenwick, and Fenwick looked at his boots. "He came back up," Greer said slowly. "Well then," Pemberton clicked his pencil against his teeth, "and his report?" "That's just it, Sergeant," Greer said. He lowered his voice not because he wished to keep it from his workers, they already knew, but because saying it loudly seemed somehow wrong, as though it might provoke something. "He won't talk, not a word since he came up, he's over there." Greer nodded toward a spot 30 feet away where a young man with a pale, clay-smeared face sat on an overturned pail, with a cup of tea cooling in his hands, staring at nothing with the fixed concentration of a man reading text that only he could see. His name was Arthur Coles. He was 24 years old. He had been working for Thomas Greer for 3 years. In all that time, Greer had found him to be a cheerful, talkative, sometimes maddening presence who could not be silenced if he tried. He had not spoken a single word since climbing back up the rope. Pemberton walked over to him, crouched down, looked into the young man's face. "Son," he said gently, "what did you see down there?" Arthur Coles turned his head and looked at Pemberton with eyes that had seen something large enough to squeeze out everything else his mind had formerly contained. His mouth opened, his lips moved. "It should have stayed closed," Arthur said. Pemberton straightened, his knees clicked. He turned and looked back at the hole in the road. "Send for Detective Inspector Kane," he said to one of the constables, "and nobody else goes down that hole, not yet." But the church bells kept ringing, or something in the hole kept making a sound that resembled them, and the workers stood in the rain with their lanterns and their discomfort, and the water ran in dark rivers across the broken cobblestones and disappeared into the hole and fell, and fell, and fell, into the darkness below Whitechapel. They set up a temporary barrier around the collapse using rope and wooden stakes. A crowd began to gather despite the rain. It was always a crowd in Whitechapel for any kind of spectacle, because spectacle was one of the few free entertainments remaining in a neighbourhood where even joy had a price. The crowd pressed against the ropes and craned their necks and asked each other questions that none of them could answer. An elderly woman near the front, a thin, black-shawled creature who sold watercress from a basket, said to no one in particular, "They found the old way down then." And when the man beside her asked her what she meant, she simply shook her head and would not say another word. The rain fell harder. The bells continued their strange echo from below. Arthur Coles sat on his pail and drank nothing and said nothing, and looked at things that were not there. And the morning wore on around him the way all mornings wore on in Whitechapel, with difficulty, and without apology. Chapter 2: The Missing Constable. Detective Inspector Edmund Kane arrived at Galston Street at 9:30, by which point the rain had settled into the particular kind of steady, committed downpour that Londoners called a real one, the sort of rain that had abandoned all pretense of being temporary and had instead declared its intention to remain indefinitely. Kane was 41, lean, and possessed of the kind of face that had never been young, not truly, not even in photographs from 30 years prior, which showed a boy with ancient eyes standing very straight in a school uniform as though already preparing for a future full of unpleasant things. He wore a charcoal overcoat that had been good once and was still serviceable, and a hat with a brim wide enough to keep most of the rain off his face. He carried a walking stick he did not need for walking. He had been awake since 3 in the morning because of the Ripper. They were all awake since 3 in the morning because of the Ripper. The murders had begun in August, Mary Ann Nichols, then Annie Chapman, then the two in one night that everyone was still not quite believing, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, and then, worst of all, Mary Jane Kelly in Miller's Court, 13 days ago, a horror so complete and so deliberate that half the constabulary had taken to drinking themselves to sleep, and the other half simply could not sleep at all. The Ripper had not been caught. The Ripper had not been identified. The Ripper, as far as anyone could determine from available evidence, had simply stopped, or was waiting, or was laughing, or was doing something else entirely in some subterranean place that decent men had not yet thought to look. Kane stood at the edge of the collapse and looked down. "I want someone down there," he said to Pemberton. "I've been saying that, sir," Pemberton agreed, "only there's been some reluctance." "Not the workers, one of ours." Kane looked at the two young constables, who both suddenly discovered urgent reasons to examine their boot buckles. "Where's Marston?" Constable James Marston was 22, recently transferred from a quieter district, and possessed of the unfortunate quality of actually volunteering for things. He had been standing slightly behind the other two constables, with the optimistic posture of a man hopping not to be noticed, but at the sound of his name, he stepped forward with the mechanical obedience of training overriding instinct. "Sir," he said. Kane looked at him for a moment. "You're going down. Take a lantern, 2 lanterns if you can manage, and a length of rope. Note everything you see. Everything. The shape of the tunnel, the construction, any markings on the walls or floor, any evidence of recent human presence. Come back in 30 minutes regardless of what you found." "Yes, sir." "And Marston." "Sir, if you hear anything unusual you come back immediately. Don't investigate sounds, come back." Marston nodded, already reaching for the coil of rope that Fenwick held out to him with a face that made it clear Fenwick was very glad to be handing it to someone else. They lowered him on the rope at 10 o'clock. They watched the twin glow of his lanterns diminish as he descended, smaller and smaller, and then the darkness thickened around him and the lanterns shrank to 2 distant points of amber light, and then even those disappeared as the tunnel evidently curved away from the vertical, and Constable James Marston was gone from sight. They waited. The rain fell. The crowd at the rope barriers shifted and murmured. 15 minutes passed. Greer checked his watch 3 times in the space of 5 minutes. Pemberton wrote in his notebook and then stopped writing and simply watched the hole. The workers stood in a loose cluster and said nothing. Arthur Coles sat on his pail. 25 minutes. Marston, Pemberton called into the hole. His voice went down and kept going and did not come back. 30 minutes. 40. An hour. Kane stood at the edge of the hole and stared into it with an expression that had become, over the preceding hour, perfectly blank, the face of a man exerting considerable effort to feel nothing. "Send another man down," he said. Sir Pemberton began. "With strict instructions. He goes down, he looks for Marston, and he comes back in 15 minutes. He does not follow Marston if Marston went further than the immediate tunnel. He comes back." They sent Constable Harris, who was older and less inclined to volunteer for anything, and clearly felt a great personal injustice was being committed against him. He went down the rope with the grim face of a man attending his own funeral. He came back in 11 minutes, so fast and with such desperate upward energy that they had to brace themselves to catch him at the rim. Harris stood in the rain and breathed very deliberately for a full minute before he could speak. He was not a man prone to visible emotion. He had been a constable for 18 years and had attended more unpleasant scenes than he cared to count, but his hands were shaking. "The tunnel," he said, "goes on further than I went, maybe 100 feet before it opens up into something larger." He paused, "But I couldn't go on." "Why not?" Kane asked. Harris looked at him. "Because of the door, sir." "What doors?" "There's a door at the end of the first tunnel. Big iron on a frame that's worked right into the old stone, chains on it, heavy chains, old ones, rusted." He paused again. "And Marston's lantern was sitting on the ground in front of it." "Just his lantern," Kane said. "Yes, sir, just the lantern." Harris looked at the hole. "There's no sign of Marston, none at all, just the lantern." The crowd had gone very quiet. Even the rain seemed for a moment to have lessened. "The door," Kane said carefully, "was it open?" Harris took a long time to answer. "No, sir," he said at last. "It was shut, but while I was standing there looking at it," he stopped. "Go on." "I heard something," Harris said. "On the other side, a sound like voices, or I don't know, it could have been water moving through stone, but it didn't sound like water." Kane turned back to the hole and stood there with his walking stick and the rain tapping steadily on his hat brim, and he thought about Constable Marston, 22 years old, a good boy, inclined to volunteer, and he thought about a door chained shut in the dark beneath Whitechapel, and he thought about the sound that might have been water and might have been voices. "Seal the access for now," he said. "Nobody in or out, I need maps." He walked back toward his carriage through the crowd, and the crowd parted for him, and the rain closed in behind him, and the lantern at the edge of the hole, the one they'd left burning at the rim, guttered in a wind that came from underground and almost went out, and then steadied again and burned. Chapter 3: The Map of Whitechapel. The map room at H Division, the Whitechapel Division of the Metropolitan Police, was a small, low-ceilinged office on the second floor of the Lemon Street station that smelled permanently of tobacco and damp paper. The walls were hung with large-scale maps of the district, street maps, drainage maps, census maps, and a series of older charts whose provenance was uncertain and whose paper had gone the color of weak tea. Red pins marked locations of interest. Blue pins marked the locations of the Ripper's victims, and there were 6 blue pins, and every man in the room was aware of them at all times in the way you are aware of a sound in the walls of a house at night. Kane arrived at noon and spent 3 hours with his junior detective, Sergeant Robert Fallow, going through every document related to the underground structure of Whitechapel that the division could locate. Fallow was 35, Welsh, meticulous, and the sort of man who genuinely enjoyed archives, who found something close to pleasure in the orderly arrangement of information, and for this quality Kane had valued him more than he usually expressed. "Here," Fallow said, spreading a map across the central table and anchoring its corners with reference books. "This is from 1821, survey of subterranean drainage and foundation works, commissioned before they rebuilt the Church of St. Mary Matfelon." He pointed to a dense network of hand-drawn lines crossing beneath the printed street pattern. "These are the known tunnels." Kane bent over the map. The tunnel network was more extensive than he'd expected, a webwork of passages running beneath the streets at varying depths, some of them clearly modern drainage channels, others marked with notations suggesting much greater age. The older ones, drawn in a different hand and a slightly darker ink, spread in a radial pattern beneath the district, converging. They all go toward one point, Kane said. Yes, Fallow put his finger on the map. It landed on a spot beneath Galston Street. Kane straightened. What else? Fallow produced a second map, then a third. This one's from 1803, survey for the new roadworks. The same radial pattern, the same convergence. And this, 1771, Board of Works survey. Older still, the lines shakier, the annotations in an archaic cursive that required effort to read, but unmistakable. Every tunnel, every passage, every recorded underground way in Whitechapel for 100 years had been drawn toward the same point. Kane stood back. On the wall, the 6 blue pins gleamed dully in the afternoon light. Put the murder sites on this map, he said. Fallow took a pencil and, consulting his own notebook, marked 6 points on the 1821 survey. He stepped back. They both looked. Mary Ann Nichols, Bucks Row. Annie Chapman, Hanbury Street. Elizabeth Stride, Burner Street. Catherine Eddowes, Mitre Square. Mary Jane Kelly, Miller's Court. And 1 point marked only with a question mark, a location that Kane had added himself, representing the only solid piece of evidence from the Kelly murder scene that had never been explained. A set of muddy bootprints leading toward a drain grate at the edge of the court, prints too large for any suspect they had identified, which stopped at the grate and did not come back. The 6 murder sites and the question mark formed a rough ring around the convergence point beneath Galston Street. Every tunnel leads to the door, Kane said. Yes, Fallow said. He was quiet for a moment. And this one, he pointed to a tunnel that ran directly north from the convergence, a long straight passage rendered in a peculiar double line that distinguished it from the others. Do you see where it goes? Kane traced it with his finger, north then east then curving slightly south. Miller's Court, he said. Fallow nodded. The tunnel passes directly beneath Miller's Court, directly beneath the room where Mary Kelly was murdered. The room was very quiet. Outside, a cart rattled over cobblestones and a child shouted something, and rain tapped on the window glass with patient insistence. There's one more thing, Fallow said. He opened his notebook to a page he'd marked with a strip of paper. I spoke to the archivist at Guildhall this morning. He found a reference in the records of the City of London Corporation, dated 1643, to a sealed underground chamber beneath the Whitechapel district, sealed, the record says, by order of the bishop and for the eternal safety of the parish. The record doesn't say what the chamber contains or why it was sealed. He paused. But it does say that the sealing was performed, with all ceremony appropriate to the grave circumstance, and with great haste, the need being urgent. Kane looked at the map for a long time. With great haste, he repeated. Yes, whatever they put down there, Kane said quietly, they were in a hurry to shut it away. He put his hand on the map, and for just a moment he felt, or imagined he felt, something, a faint vibration in the paper, as though the lines drawn upon it were not merely representations of tunnels, but conduits for something that moved through the underground dark below, something that had been moving for a very long time and had all the patience in the world. He removed his hand. I want every tunnel entrance in a 200-yard radius of Galston Street identified and watched, he said, and I want to know everything there is to know about that door. He put his hat back on and walked to the window and looked out at the wet rooftops of Whitechapel, and the chimneys trailing their thin smoke, and the grey sky pressing down, and the streets below where people moved in their thousands through the rain, none of them knowing what lay beneath their feet, what breathed in the dark below their shoes, what waited behind a rusted iron door in a tunnel that all of London's underground passages had been quietly, inexorably pointing toward for 250 years. Chapter 4 The Woman in Black. She appeared on the evening of the 13th of October, 3 days after the collapse of Galston Street, as Kane was leaving the Lemon Street station at 7:30. The street outside was thick with fog, the particular dense yellow fog of London autumn that came off the Thames and the factory chimneys and the 1,000 coal fires of the East End, and mixed into something almost solid, something you could put your hand into and feel. The gas lamps were burning, but their light barely reached the pavement, casting only dim pools of amber in the murk. A horse and carriage passed somewhere close by, invisible, the horse's hooves a muffled rhythm in the fog, and then it was gone and the street was quiet. She was standing directly across from the station entrance. Kane noticed her because she was utterly still in a street where everything was motion, the fog moving, the few pedestrians moving, a cat picking its way along a wall. She was still like a thing that had been placed there deliberately, a statue or a sign. She was dressed entirely in black, which was not unusual in a neighborhood where morning dress was everyday clothing, but she wore a veil so dense that her face was invisible behind it, and she was watching the station door with an attention that communicated itself across the foggy street with uncomfortable clarity. Kane crossed toward her. As he approached, he was struck by the odd quality of her presence. She seemed to absorb the fog around her rather than be obscured by it, standing in a small zone of relative clarity while everything else dissolved. "Good evening," he said. "Inspector Kane," she said. Her voice was low and quite steady and carried no identifiable accent that he could name. "You know me. Everyone in Whitechapel knows you." There was nothing unfriendly in her voice, but nothing warm either. "You're looking for what's beneath the street." "I'm investigating a structural collapse," Kane said. He was aware that this was a technically accurate statement that conveyed almost nothing true. "You're looking for the Ripper," she said, "and you found something that makes you think the answers are underground." She paused. "You should stop." "I should stop looking for a murderer." "You should stop looking underground." Her veil moved slightly in a breath of foggy air. "What is down there has nothing to do with your investigation. Nothing you find there will lead you to a man you can arrest and try and hang. What is down there is older than your law, older than your city, older than your understanding of the word evil." Kane studied her veil. "Who are you?" "Someone whose grandmother was alive the last time someone opened that door," she said, "and spent the remainder of her life regretting it." "The door was opened before." "In 1811, she said. "You may look up the Ratcliffe Highway murders if you're not familiar. 7 people killed in a week, 2 in a single night, with a savagery that the authorities at the time could not explain. The man they blamed was found dead in his cell before he could be tried, and the official story was closed and the door was sealed again." She paused. "And in 1788 before that, and in 1765, and before that in times that predate your records." Kane was quiet for a moment. "And the Ripper," he said, "you think—" "The Ripper was never alone," she said. The words landed with a peculiar weight, as though they had been dropped from a height. "Explain that," Kane said. But she had already turned. She walked into the fog 3 steps, 4, and the fog closed around her with the seamless ease of water closing over a stone, and she was gone, not obscured, gone, as completely and immediately as if she had never been there. Kane stood in the foggy street for a long moment. Then he looked down at the pavement where she had been standing. No footprints. The street was wet and the cobblestones held moisture clearly. His own footprints were visible approaching across the road. But where she had stood there was nothing, not a mark, not a depression in the wet grime of the pavement. He stood there for a long time, with the fog pressing close and the gas lamp throwing its small inadequate circle of light, and the sounds of Whitechapel moving around him, voices, wheels, distant bells, and he thought about what she had said. The Ripper was never alone. He turned and went back into the station and went immediately to Fallow's desk and said, "Look up the Ratcliffe Highway murders, 1811, everything you can find." Fallow, who had been about to go home, took off his hat and sat back down. Chapter 5, The Symbol on the Door. They went back underground on the 15th of October, 4 days after the collapse, with a party of 6. Kane, Fallow, 2 experienced constables who had been told only that they were investigating a tunnel network, a surveyor named Alderwick who had mapped underground passages for the Metropolitan Board of Works and claimed to be indifferent to darkness, and a locksmith named Greaves who had been brought in under the pretense that they might need to open various structures. They descended through the Galston Street opening on rope ladders, lanterns in hand, into the cold dark beneath the city. The tunnel was immediately extraordinary. The stone that formed its walls was far older than anything Kane had seen in London's underground. Older than Roman, some part of him suspected, though he could not have said on what basis, except that it had the quality of age that goes beyond calculation, the quality of things that predate the human habit of counting years. The blocks were enormous, some of them 6 feet long, fitted with such precision that no mortar had been used and no crack appeared between them. The floor was smooth and slightly curved, as though worn by centuries of use. The ceiling arched overhead in a pointed vault. Alderwick ran his hand along the wall as they walked and said nothing, but his expression was that of a man having a long-held assumption firmly overturned. They walked for perhaps 3 minutes, 200 feet by Alderwick's estimate, before the tunnel widened slightly and presented them with the door. It was immense, 10 feet tall and 6 feet wide, set into a frame of iron that had been embedded directly into the ancient stone, the metal blackened and streaked with rust but fundamentally solid, bolted into the rock at 4 points with iron brackets each the size of a man's torso. The door itself was iron, a plate iron, inches thick, riveted across its surface in a pattern that had once been regular, but was now distorted by the expansion and contraction of 200 years. 3 chains of heavy iron links were looped across it, each secured with a padlock the size of a man's head, each padlock green with verdigris and rough with corrosion, but when Greaves approached and examined them with professional care, each one still engaged, still locked. "Not been opened recently," Greaves said quietly, and seemed relieved to be saying it. But it was not the chains that held Kane's attention. It was the symbols. They covered the door in 3 concentric rings, carved directly into the iron, not engraved with a chisel but pressed into the metal itself, as though someone had applied enormous heat and pressure, or as though the metal had somehow flowed around the symbols and hardened into them. The outer ring was the largest symbols, each one 8 or 9 inches tall. The middle ring was smaller. The innermost ring, nearest the center of the door, was fine work, tiny and precise, the lines so thin they were almost invisible until the lantern caught them at a certain angle. None of them matched any alphabet or writing system that Kane recognized. They were not letters. They might have been pictograms. He could see in some of them shapes that suggested a human figure, or a flame, or something with wings, but they were unlike pictograms from any civilization he could identify. "Greaves," he said, "can you open the locks?" Greaves crouched before the first padlock, produced his picks, worked at it for several minutes with the concentration of a craftsman, and then sat back and looked at his picks and then at the lock and then said slowly, "I can't. These aren't made like I don't know what mechanism is in here. It's not a standard pin tumbler, it's not a lever lock. Whatever's holding this closed, it's not conventional." He paused. "It's as if they were never meant to be opened from this side." On the floor before the door, dry and perfectly placed in the center of the tunnel, was Marston's lantern. Just as Harris had said, the lantern was cold and extinguished, the oil inside it still half full, the wick untrimmed. Kane crouched and picked it up and turned it in his hands. He set it down deliberately, Fallow said quietly from beside him. "Yes," Kane said, which means he had both hands free. Kane looked at the door, then at the lantern, then at the floor between the two where the stone was smooth and carried no marks, no drag marks, no blood, no disturbance of the thin layer of ancient grime. "Something let him in," Kane said, and then, or he opened it himself and then it was shut again from the other side. The tunnel was very quiet. The sound of 6 men breathing was the only sound, and it seemed very small. Fallow had been studying the symbols on the door with a lantern held close, making quick notes in his book. He straightened now and beckoned Kane to the lower right corner of the middle ring. "Here," he said, "this one." The symbol was perhaps 4 inches across, carved in the middle ring. It was a complex shape, 2 vertical strokes connected by a horizontal crossing and overlaid with a shape like an open eye. It was not inherently sinister in appearance. Dozens of symbols on the door were stranger-looking. "I recognize this," Fallow said. His voice was careful, steady in the way that a man's voice is when he is working to prevent it from shaking. "I've seen this symbol before." "Where's?" "The Ripper letters." Fallow opened his notebook and produced from inside the cover a folded piece of paper, a reproduction of one of the letters received by the Central News Agency, one of the ones considered potentially genuine. He held it beside the door with his lantern. Near the bottom of the letter, almost illegible in what had appeared to be a smear or a flourish, was the same shape. The same 2 verticals, the same crossing line, the same eye. Kane looked at the symbol on the door, looked at the letter, looked at the door again. The fresh blood stains on the door's lower right corner, which he had noticed on arrival but not yet addressed, were still dark, barely dried. He had thought at first they might be animal blood or Marston's, but there was no body and no wound and no trail leading toward them. They were in the shape of a handprint, both hands. Someone had pressed both blood-wet hands flat against the door and held them there. "He was here," Kane said. "Whatever he is, he was here." Chapter 6: The Secret of the Priest. The Church of St. Jude in Whitechapel had been demolished 20 years earlier, and its archives transferred, in cardboard boxes of varying states of collapse, to the vestry of the nearby Church of St. Mary Matfelon, where they had been deposited in a back room without anyone subsequently paying them much attention. It was in this room, on the evening of the 16th of October, that Fallow and a young constable named Briggs spent 4 hours going through papers so old and fragile that some of them disintegrated slightly at the touch. The relevant document was in the 5th box. Fallow found it at 9:30, by which time his lantern oil had run low, and Briggs was asleep in his chair with his chin on his chest. It was a journal, leather-bound, thick, about 160 pages, written in a crabbed ecclesiastical hand that had once been confident and became, over the course of the journal's entries, increasingly erratic, the letters growing larger, the lines less regular, the ink applied with something approaching violence in the later pages, as though the pen had been driven into the page rather than moved across it. The journal belonged to Father Samuel Rees, parish priest of St. Jude's, Whitechapel. The first entries were dated 1839. They were routine parish business, the weather, notes on sermons, observations about his congregation. In the margins, Fallow saw that Rees had a habit of small illustrations, little sketched faces, architectural details, occasional symbols. By 1841, the tone of the journal had changed. Fallow read, with growing attention, accounts of Rees being approached by members of his parish who reported strange sounds coming from beneath their houses, sounds that the priest noted with careful professional skepticism could be attributed to rats or underground water, but the reports continued and multiplied. People on Galston Street and the nearby alleys were reporting not just sounds, but a quality of feeling, a sense, strongest in the small hours of the night, of something alive below them, something breathing, something aware. In 1843, Rees went underground himself. He had obtained, the journal did not explain how, ancient maps that showed the tunnel system. He followed the tunnels to the door. He recorded his experience in language that started orderly and became, by the end of the entry, fractured. The symbols on the door not carved but grown into the metal, grown, I say, as living things grow, and the sound from beyond it not water, not wind, but something with intention in it, something that knew I was there, something that wanted. The entry broke off mid-sentence. The following 2 pages had been torn out. The entry after the gap was in a different quality of handwriting, still Rees's, but compressed, careful, every letter deliberately formed, as though the writer was suppressing tremendous agitation through pure force of penmanship. I have consulted with the bishop, who has dismissed my findings as underground hysteria, his phrase, delivered with the gentle contempt with which the comfortable dismiss the frightened. But I know what I heard, I know what pressed against the door while I stood before it, and I know what whispered to me through the iron. I will not write the words here. I will not write them because I am afraid that writing them would constitute a kind of attention, a kind of acknowledgement, and I am increasingly certain, that this thing, whatever it is, draws power from being acknowledged, from being heard, from being. Again a break, a page that had not been torn out but had been heavily crossed through, the ink applied back and forth across the lines until the original words were completely obscured. The next entry. I have arranged for the sealing of the outer access points. I have done this quietly, through men who will not ask questions, and I have told no one in the parish why, and I will not. The bishop has given me no authority for this, and I proceed without it because I have no choice. The sounds are now audible without going underground. Mrs. Hartley on Galston Street reports hearing her name called from beneath her floor. Children playing in the street have begun to stop at certain spots and listen. I have seen them do it myself, 5 children, all stopping simultaneously at the corner of Galston and Wentworth, all looking down, all with the same expression that I cannot. The handwriting here became suddenly very large, each word occupying several lines. Something beneath Whitechapel whispers to the violent. And then smaller again, almost controlled. I do not know if this is its nature or its purpose or both. I know only that since the collapse in 1839 opened a crack in the old ceiling, since the air began to move between what is below and what is above, the violence in this parish has increased in ways that cannot be attributed to poverty or gin or the usual despairs. There is a quality to it now, a purposefulness, as though violence is not merely breaking out but being shaped, directed, called. Father Samuel Rees made his last journal entry on the 14th of November, 1843. It consisted of one sentence, written in the careful hand of a man making himself write it. I am going underground tonight with chains and padlocks and 3 good men who will not repeat what they see, and I will make the door as secure as I am able, and I pray that it is enough. He disappeared the same night. The 3 men who accompanied him, unnamed in the journal, identified only as good men of the parish, returned without him and refused for the rest of their lives to discuss what had happened below ground. The church records showed that Father Rees was listed as absent without explanation for 2 months, then declared dead in absentia. His possessions were distributed, his rooms were let. Nobody went looking for him, or if they did, nobody recorded it. Fallow sat alone in the back room of St. Mary Matfelon's vestry, with the old journal in his hands, and the lantern burning very low and the storm outside worrying at the windows, and he read the last entry 3 times. Then he went to find Cain. Chapter 7, The Tunnel of Voices. On the 17th of October, 3 days before everything came apart, Cain and Fallow went underground again. Just the 2 of them this time at midnight, which was Cain's choice. Daylight, he felt, was insufficient for what he needed to understand, and the men he'd brought before had served as a kind of social buffer that had prevented him from simply standing in front of the door and listening. He wanted to listen. The tunnel was different at night. This was not a rational observation. The tunnel was underground and therefore not subject to the alternation of day and night, but it was true nonetheless. The quality of the darkness was not the same. It was denser, more present. It pressed against the lantern light with something that felt almost like resistance, as though the darkness did not merely exist in the absence of light but was actively itself, actively dark. They reached the door in 3 minutes. Cain stood before it with his lantern held up and looked at it for a long time. The symbol seemed in the midnight dark to move slightly, not visibly, not demonstrably, but at the edge of perception, the way stars appear to shift when you look at them from the corner of your eye. The 3 chains hung across the iron surface with their locked padlocks unchanged. He put his ear against the cold metal of the door. He heard water, or something that might have been water, a sound with a liquid quality, a trickling, a murmur. It was regular but not mechanical. It had the irregularity of natural sound. And then, underneath the water sound, something else. Voices. He kept his ear against the door and held his breath. The voices were low, multiple, overlapping, too distant or too muffled to resolve into individual words. But they were human voices, or shaped like human voices, carrying the rhythms of speech, the rises and falls of language, the particular cadence of people talking to each other in an enclosed space. Female voices, he was certain of that much. He made himself stay, made himself listen, made himself count. 1 voice, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 distinct voices, or what sounded like 5. Talking, overlapping, murmuring with a quality that was not. He pressed himself to be exact, not frightened, not calling for help. They had a quality that was harder to name. Waiting. They sounded like women who had been waiting for a very long time and had learned to be patient about it, because patience was the only option remaining to them. He pulled back from the door. Fallow, he said. His voice came out quieter than he'd intended. Fallow came forward, pressed his ear to the door, listened. He pulled back after 30 seconds. His face was carefully composed. Women, he said. Yes. There have been no reports of missing women in the tunnels other than. Fallow stopped. Other than the 5 Ripper victims, Cain said. They looked at each other across the darkness. That is not, Fallow said, choosing his words with precision, a rational inference. No, Cain agreed. He raised his lantern again and pressed close to the door, and this time he did not put his ear to it, but simply stood within inches of the iron and listened with the whole surface of his face and the palms of his hands, the way you listen when the rational instruments feel insufficient. And then his own name. It came from behind the door clearly enough that he could not pretend he'd misheard it. Not called loudly, spoken at a normal conversational volume, the way someone says a name when they've been expecting the person it belongs to. Edmund, his given name, which he never used professionally and rarely heard spoken at all, even socially. He stepped back sharply. Did you hear that? He said. Fallow looked at him. I heard the murmuring voices. Did you hear a name? Fallow paused very carefully, he said. I heard what might have been a name, yes. Whose name? Mine, Fallow said after a silence. Robert. They looked at the door. The voices continued behind it, low, patient, waiting, and whatever they had behind the door, whatever they had become, they knew the names of the men who stood before it. Kane turned and walked back up the tunnel without another word, and Fallow followed him, and neither of them spoke again until they were back above ground in the cold October air, and even then it was a long time before either one found anything useful to say. Chapter 8: The Night of the Lockdown. By the 20th of October, the situation above ground had become what Kane's superior, Chief Inspector Waverley, described as increasingly difficult to manage, by which he meant that rumours had begun to circulate through Whitechapel about the hole in Galston Street and what the police were doing with it, and that several factions had begun pushing for information or access in ways that were becoming harder to deflect. Waverley's solution was a lockdown, a quiet one, conducted without announcement or official acknowledgement. Access to the tunnel entrances Kane's team had identified was blocked. Workers were posted at the Galston Street collapse under the guise of structural repair. The area was sectioned off with wooden barriers that bore official-looking signs about drainage works. No one went in. No one was told why. Kane spent the day of the lockdown in the Lemon Street station, reviewing Fallow's notes on the Ratcliffe Highway murders and the earlier incidents the veiled woman had mentioned, building a chronology that ran back 250 years and showed, with a regularity that should have been impossible, but was simply there in the records, a pattern. Violence in Whitechapel intensifying every few decades, reaching a peak, and then, after intervention of some kind, though the intervention was rarely well documented, subsiding, going quiet again for a generation, and then beginning again. He was working late, near 11, when the knock came on his door. Constable Banks, who had been on duty at the Galston Street barrier since 8, stood in the doorway with the expression of a man carrying news he would rather be delivering to someone else. "Another one, sir," he said. Kane was on his feet before the words were finished. The victim was a woman of approximately 35, found in a doorway on Wentworth Street, 300 yards from the sealed tunnel entrance. The manner of death was consistent, the attending surgeon said carefully, with the previous cases. The savagery was specific and purposeful and left marks that the surgeon, who had attended several of the earlier victims, recognized with professional grimness. But it was the 20th of October. Every tunnel entrance within 200 yards of Galston Street had been watched for 16 hours. Every man on Kane's team had been at their post. The streets had been under the most intensive surveillance of the entire Ripper investigation. No one had seen anything. No one had seen a man approach the victim, or leave the scene, or move on the street at any point in the relevant time window. But at the edge of the doorway where she lay, at the very threshold, as though marking an entrance or an exit, there was a smear of dark mud. Thick, wet, not the street mud of the surface, which was mixed with horse dung and city grime, and had its own recognizable quality. This was tunnel mud. Kane crouched and looked at it with his lantern, and recognized it from what he'd seen on the floor of the ancient passages below. Cold, dense, reeking faintly of something old. Below the tunnel mud, just visible at the edge of the doorway step, was the faint outline of a boot print. And from that print, leading back along the pavement to the iron grate of a street drain set into the curb 12 feet away, a trail of small marks, almost invisible, that stopped at the drain. The grate was standard city drainage, 6 inches across, far too small for a human body. Kane stood at the drain and looked down through its iron bars into the darkness below and heard, or thought he heard, infinitely far below, a sound like a door closing. The crowd had gathered quickly despite the hour. In Whitechapel the crowd was never far. They pressed against the constable's outstretched arms and murmured with the collective, restless misery of people who had been frightened for too long. A woman near the front was weeping, not theatrically but quietly, the tears running down her face with the patience of something that had been going on for a while. A man was shouting about the police and what good they were doing. Children wove between adult legs, too young to understand and too alert to stop watching. Kane looked at the crowd and felt something he had not allowed himself to feel clearly before, not horror, which he'd managed to keep at arm's length through the mechanism of professional distance, but a simpler, older thing, helplessness. The helplessness of standing between people and something you did not have the tools to fight. "We need to open the door," he said to Fallow, quietly enough that no one else heard. Fallow beside him was quiet for a moment. You think that's where Marston is? I think that's where the answer is, Kane said. I think Father Rees sealed it and bought the parish 45 years of quiet, and I think whatever is below has been working at the seal ever since, finding ways through, finding instruments. He looked at the drain grate, finding men willing to be instruments. Or shaping them, Fallow said, whispers to the violent. Yes. They stood in the cold night air with the crowd murmuring behind them and the gas lamps burning, and the mud from below the street still dark and wet on the doorstep of a dead woman, and they decided. They would open the door. Chapter 9, The Opening of the Door. They assembled at midnight on the 21st of October. Kane, Fallow, 4 constables selected for steadiness, Greaves the locksmith with his most specialised tools, and at Kane's insistence, after an argument with Waverley that had lasted 3 hours and concluded with Waverley simply putting on his hat and leaving rather than continue, the surveyor Alderwick, who had spent the intervening days examining every plan and map of the underground structure he could locate and had theories he wanted to test in situ. They descended through the Galston Street, opening at 20 minutes past midnight. Greaves spent 40 minutes on the locks. He had brought different tools than the first time, specialist equipment he had obtained from a colleague who worked on historical restoration projects, tools designed for mechanisms outside the standard catalogue. He worked in the silence of someone who has closed out everything except the problem in his hands, and eventually, one lock, then the second, then the third, he stepped back with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with something less comfortable. Done, he said. The chains were heavy enough that removing them from the door required 4 men and considerable effort. They fell to the floor of the tunnel with a crash that rang through the passages and took a long time to fade, longer than the acoustics should have allowed, as though the echoes had somewhere to go. The door had a bar on the outside. Iron in a bracket. This too had corroded but was not engaged. It had been left up, not down, as though someone had intended the door to be opened again from the outside, or as though whoever had last shut it from the inside had not had the opportunity to secure the bar. Kane gripped the edge of the door. The iron was cold even through his gloves. He looked at Fallow, who gave a small nod. He pulled. The door moved, a grinding of corroded iron on iron, a sound like a thing in pain. The hinges screamed. Cold air moved out from behind it, a current of air that was very cold and very dry and that carried in it a smell impossible to categorize. Not organic, not mineral, something between the two, something with no referent in Kane's experience. He pulled the door the rest of the way open. They raised their lanterns. The chamber beyond was large, vastly larger than the tunnel, larger than the door's proportions had suggested it could be, as though the space behind the door occupied dimensions that the mathematics of the tunnel couldn't account for. A great vaulted ceiling rose 40 feet overhead. The floor was smooth-worked stone, the same dark material as the tunnels, stretching perhaps 100 feet in every direction. The walls curved away into shadows too deep for their lanterns to penetrate. The air was cold and still and dry. Alderwick made a sound that was not quite a word, and began counting his steps and looking upward. But it was not the dimensions of the chamber that stopped them all. It was the walls. From the height of a man's knee to the height of a man's outstretched hand, running in lines as regular as ruled paper, the walls of the chamber were covered in names. Not carved, written, in a substance that might have been ink or might have been something else. It was dark, nearly black, and in places had run slightly before drying, leaving trails that looked disturbingly organic. Thousands upon thousands of names, written in a compact hand that was consistent across the entire visible surface, as though written by one hand working very quickly over a very long time. Kane walked to the nearest wall and raised his lantern. The names were not historical names. They were not names from the distant past. He looked at a dozen of them and recognized none, but they had the quality of contemporary names, the forms and patterns of Victorian English, of Irish, of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, of the multiplicity of people who lived in Whitechapel. And beside each name a date. He checked the dates near his eye level: November 1888, December 1888, January 1889, February, March. Future dates. All future dates. He looked further along the wall, further toward the shadows at the edges. The dates grew further forward. 1890, 1895, 1900, 1910. The handwriting remained consistent throughout, the same compact, rapid hand writing names that had not yet belonged to people who had not yet died. Their deaths, Fallow said quietly from behind him. He was looking at another section of wall. The dates are, I think these are dates of death. Look here, Margaret Holly's the 3rd of March, 1889. And here, he stopped. What? Kane said. Here, Fallow said, his voice was very steady. Robert Fallow, the 5th of April, 1889. The chamber was entirely silent. And here, Fallow said, his voice unchanged, Edmund Kane, the 12th of November, 1888. He paused. That's 3 weeks from now, Kane said. Yes, Fallow said. They stood in the vast underground chamber with their lanterns, throwing small circles of light against walls covered in the names of the dead and the not yet dead, and from somewhere in the shadows at the far end of the chamber, too far for their light to reach, came a sound. A single footstep, very deliberate, very slow. Chapter 10, The Figure Below London. The footstep was followed by another, and another. They came from the far end of the chamber, from the region of complete darkness beyond the reach of their lanterns, regular, unhurried, with the pace of someone who has all the time available and knows it. Each step had a weight to it, a solidity that echoed against the stone ceiling and the stone floor in ways that made it difficult to determine how many sets of feet it might represent. Could have been one person walking, could have been several, walking in perfect unison. The constables had drawn their truncheons. Greaves had pressed himself against the wall near the door. Alderwick had his notebook open, as though documenting what was happening might provide some protection from it. Police, Fallow said sharply. His voice rang in the chamber and came back to him from the walls. Show yourself. The footsteps did not pause. They continued at the same measured pace, from the darkness at the chamber's far end. Kane raised his lantern as high as he could. The figure appeared at the edge of his lantern's reach, not all at once but gradually, the darkness giving it up reluctantly. Revealing first a pair of booted feet, then legs in dark trousers, then the lower edge of a long Victorian coat, black floor length of the kind that had been fashionable perhaps a decade earlier, then the coat's middle, the hands at its sides gloved perfectly still, then the chest, the shoulders, and then the hood, or what he had taken for a hood. The coat's collar was raised very high and from within it rose nothing. No face. The hood or collar or whatever it was framed an absolute darkness where a face should have been, darkness of a quality distinct from the ambient dark of the chamber, darkness that was present in the way that objects are present, dimensional, occupying space. The figure stopped walking when it was 30 feet from them. It stood in the faint edge of the lantern light, which illuminated everything about it except its face, and it was still. One of the constables made a sound that began as speech and ended as something else. Kane took 3 steps toward the figure. He was not sure why he did this, not bravery, not recklessness, something closer to the compulsion that makes you look at a thing you know you should not look at, the compulsion of the eye toward the unacceptable. He raised his lantern. The light reached the figure's face. There was nothing there. Not nothing in the sense of a blank face or a face in shadow. Nothing in the literal sense the hood or collar that should have framed a human head framed an absence. Inside the collar there was no face, no head, no neck, nothing. The coat stood in the chamber without anything inside it where a person should be, except the quality of presence, of weight, of something inhabiting it that was not visible. And yet it turned a slight turn of what should have been its head, and Kane had the absolute conviction that it was looking at him, that something was looking at him from behind the face it didn't have, that something had recognized him. He had not moved, neither had the figure. Kane, Fallow said from behind him very quietly, "We need to go." The figure raised one hand. The gloved hand came up slowly and pointed, not at Kane, not at Fallow, but at the names on the wall, at the thousands of names and their dates. It held this pointing gesture with the patience of something for whom patience is not a quality but a condition of being. Then from the ceiling came a sound. A crack first, a single sharp crack of ancient stone under pressure, and then a long grinding sound of something structural beginning to fail, and then the chamber trembled, not violently but unmistakably, with the deep shiver of massive things beginning to move. Dust fell from the ceiling. A section of wall to their left shed a shower of small stones. Out, Kane shouted. Chapter 11, The Final Seal. The collapse began in the chamber's ceiling but spread with terrible speed. They ran. Kane didn't look back. He could hear the sounds behind him, and the sounds were sufficient. The crack and groan of ancient stone, the bass rumble of sections of ceiling making their first contact with the floor, the hiss of dust cascading down the walls, and underneath all of it, around and through it, a sound that was not structural at all, a sound that came from the thing standing in the middle of the chamber, a sound that was not a scream and not a word but carried the qualities of both, something vast and old expressing something that had no human analogue. They reached the door. Greaves went through first, then Alderwick, then the constables, 2, 3. Fallow grabbed the edge of the doorframe and threw himself through. Kane was last. The chamber behind him was no longer dark. Light had appeared, not from any lantern they had brought but from the walls themselves, from the names written on them, which had begun to glow with a cold blue-white light that illuminated the falling stone and the roiling dust and the figure at the far end, still standing, still pointing, still, impossibly, still. Kane went through the door. "Close it," Fallow shouted. Between them, with the grinding of the collapsed iron and the thunderous complaint of the tunnels starting to settle around them, they heaved the door shut. It engaged with the frame, a percussion of iron on iron that they felt in their teeth. The chains, they could not relock the chains, not without Greaves at the locks, and time they didn't have. But the bar, the iron bar on the outside in its bracket. Kane reached up and slammed it down. And then they ran. The tunnel was collapsing. Not catastrophically, not like a mine explosion, everything at once, but progressively, section by section, the old stone succumbing in sequence from the chamber forward, as though whatever had provided the underground architecture with its integrity for 200 years was withdrawing itself from the equation with methodical thoroughness. They ran by lantern light through a tunnel that was shedding itself around them, stone falling from the walls, dust thick enough that breathing was a deliberate act. The rope ladder to the Galston Street surface was 60 seconds of running away. They covered it in 40. They went up the rope in pairs. Kane was second to last behind Fallow, and as he climbed he could feel the vibration in the rope from the settling of the stone below, could hear the sounds of the tunnel continuing to fail, and he was almost certain he could hear, from behind the closed door, behind the iron bar, muffled through 50 feet of stone and 2 inches of corroded metal. One pair of footsteps, still walking, still deliberate. Coming closer. He cleared the surface, and the workers waiting above pulled him up, and he rolled clear of the opening on the wet Galston Street cobblestones, and lay there for a moment in the rain, with the sounds of the collapsing underground below him, feeling like a second heartbeat through the stone. When he sat up, Fallow was beside him. All 4 constables were there. Greaves, Alderwick, who was still writing in his notebook. They were all there. No, not all. "Where's Kane?" began. He counted again, a third time. He went back to the rim of the opening. Below, the sounds of the collapse were still continuing, a deep, deliberate settling, the occasional crack of a major stone failing, the rush of smaller debris. "Who went back?" he said. Nobody answered. "Who went back?" Constable Dyer, one of the 4 who'd been underground with them, a solid, experienced man of 37 whom Kane had known for 10 years, was not present. Kane looked around the assembled faces in the rain and the lantern light. "He went back for something," one of the other constables said. His voice was shaking. "When we were at the door, he went back. I thought he'd come." Kane looked at the opening. The sounds of collapse below had changed. They were slower now, further away. The tunnel was sealing itself. In another hour, maybe less, the passage would be blocked and there would be nothing to go back down into. In a day, the surface would settle and the opening itself might close over, a wound in the city healing itself. "Dyer," Kane said, "into the hole." The hole said nothing back. Workers were already arriving, a team that had been standing by per Waverley's instructions for exactly this moment. They came with timber and sand and stone and mortar, and they began in the rain to fill the opening, to seal the gap, to close what had been opened. Kane stood to one side and watched them work and did not speak. Fallow stood beside him in silence. When the first layer of fill went in, Kane thought he heard from very far below, attenuated through stone and collapse and distance, and the sounds of the workers and the rain, a sound like footsteps. He did not say this to Fallow. He stood in the rain until the opening was filled, and then he walked back to the station, and he wrote his report, and the report was very careful and very accurate and contained almost nothing that was true. Chapter 12, The Legend Beneath Whitechapel. The official record as it came to be written contained the following facts. That a structural collapse in Galston Street on the 10th of October, 1888, had exposed a section of historically significant underground tunnel work, possibly Roman in origin. That police investigation had confirmed the tunnel was structurally unsafe and had collapsed entirely by the 22nd of October. That Constable James Marston had been lost in the initial collapse and his body had not been recovered. That Constable William Dyer had likewise been lost in the subsequent collapse on the 21st of October, and his body had similarly not been recovered. That both men were to be commended for their service. That the area had been sealed, and the tunnels removed from underground survey maps pending structural assessment. The assessment never came. The tunnels were simply removed from the maps. Excised. The official record of London's subterranean cartography was quietly adjusted so that the network of passages beneath Whitechapel, passages that had been documented for 100 years in surveys going back to the Georgian era, simply ceased to exist on paper. A surveyor at the Board of Works took the relevant documents home one evening, burned them in his fireplace, and told his wife he had done what was necessary. He never explained further. Waverley wrote a brief internal memorandum, marked confidential and addressed to no one specific, which said only that certain underground investigations in Whitechapel had been concluded to the satisfaction of all appropriate parties, and that no further inquiry was warranted. The memorandum was filed and forgotten. The Ripper murders stopped. This was the fact that occupied Edmund Kane for the rest of his professional life, not the chamber beneath the streets, not the figure without a face, not the names on the walls or the voices from behind the door. Those things he managed, through long practice and an iron disposition, to categorize as experiences for which he lacked adequate explanatory frameworks, and to keep in a mental room with a closed door of its own. But the murders stopped. After the 5th, after Mary Kelly, before the collapse, at the height of what the newspapers were calling a reign of terror, they simply stopped. No 6th victim, no 7th, the Ripper, whoever or whatever the Ripper had been, did not kill again. And the obvious inference, the one that Kane turned away from and returned to and turned away from again for 20 years, was that the murders had stopped because the thing behind the door had stopped requiring them, or because the door was shut again, or because whatever purpose the killings had served, in whatever economy of violence and power operated below the streets, had been served. Or disrupted. He never knew which. Robert Fallow retired from the Metropolitan Police in 1901 and died in 1903 of natural causes. In his effects was found a notebook, not his official investigation notebook but a personal one, written in the margins of his years, filled with observations and inferences that he had never submitted to any official record. The notebook eventually passed, through a series of inheritances and estate sales, into the possession of a private collector who had no idea what it was and stored it in a box with other Victorian ephemera. In the notebook, on a page dated November 1888, Fallow had written, "I have been trying to understand what it is that lives, if lives is the right word, which I doubt below Whitechapel. I think lives is wrong. It does not live in the sense that we live. It exists. It has existed for a very long time, longer than London, possibly longer than human civilization in this island. It exists in the same way that certain geological formations exist, not as a thing that was created and might cease, but as a feature of the world, as permanent as a river or a cliff, except that it is aware and it hungers, and it shapes human violence around itself the way a river shapes a landscape, not by force but by the persistent influence of its presence. The names on the walls, I cannot stop thinking about the names on the walls, thousands of them with dates that lie ahead of us. Were those names written by it? Did it write its intentions on its own walls, the record of a harvest it intends to make? Or were the names written by someone else, by some earlier visitor, someone who knew what the thing was planning and left a record in the only place it could be left, where the thing itself would not think to look because it did not consider the chamber's walls to be a place where human messages could be stored? I do not know, I will probably not find out, but I have checked the date written beside my own name, and it lies 5 months from now, and I find that I am making very particular use of those 5 months, which is perhaps the most honest response to the situation. He is wrong for what it matters. I lived considerably past 1889. Whatever wrote those names either made mistakes or had intentions it did not carry through. This seems important to know, though I cannot precisely say why. The door is shut. The bar is down. Whatever sealed it before Rees and those before Rees and those before them was sufficient for a generation or two, sometimes longer. Perhaps this sealing will hold as long or longer. Perhaps whatever intelligence operates in that chamber will find another way, as it always seems to, because something that has existed as long as it has, and has all the patience of the stone itself, cannot be permanently contained by iron and chains. But for now the door is shut. Constable James Marston was never found. The official record listed him as dead. The unofficial understanding among the men who knew what had happened was the same. But on the morning of the 23rd of October, 1888, a shopkeeper on Galston Street named Hammond reported that he had heard, very clearly, at approximately 3 a.m, a sound from below his shop floor that he described as a man knocking, with the regular and patient rhythm of someone who expects to be heard eventually. The knocking lasted for 30 minutes, according to Hammond, who had listened to it from his bed with the covers pulled up and his wife's hand in his, and a candle burning on the bedside table. Then it stopped. Then, after a silence of perhaps 10 minutes, it resumed. Hammond did not report the sounds to the police until that morning because, as he explained carefully to the constable who took his statement, he was afraid that if he went downstairs to investigate, the knocking would stop, and then he would be alone in his shop at 3 a.m. with the knowledge that something below his floor had been knocking and had now gone quiet, and that second thing seemed considerably worse to him than the first. No action was taken on Hammond's report. It was filed with the other reports from that period. There were several dozen of them, people on Galston Street and the surrounding streets reporting sounds from below, sounds of knocking, sounds of what might have been footsteps, sounds described variously as moaning or breathing or the movement of water, and the file was eventually closed on the grounds that all the sounds described were consistent with settling of the underground structure following the collapse, and were to be expected, and would diminish over time. They did diminish. Over weeks and months the reports became less frequent, and then stopped entirely, and life in Whitechapel returned to the ordinary rhythms of difficulty and survival. But in the years that followed, 5 years, 10, 20, there were occasional nights in November and October when residents of Galston Street and the adjacent alleys reported sounds from below their floors or from beneath the street surface. A regular, rhythmic knocking, heard always after midnight, always in the coldest weeks of autumn when the fog was thickest, and the gas lamps cast their most inadequate pools of light. A sound reported again and again across the decades of something knocking on a door from the inside, asking, with the perfect patience of something that has waited centuries and knows it can wait centuries more, to be let out. In 1923, during excavations for a gas main extension, workers on Galston Street struck an obstruction at a depth of 30 feet. They reported to their foreman that they had encountered what appeared to be a large iron plate, part of an old underground structure, possibly Victorian or earlier, now buried and filled in. The foreman sent a worker down to assess whether it needed to be cleared. The worker came back up after 4 minutes. He went straight to the foreman's hut, sat down and asked for a cup of tea. He held the cup in both hands and looked at the middle distance. The foreman asked him what was down there. "A door," the worker said. "We know that," the foreman said. "How big can we go around it?" "It's large," the worker said, and then after a pause in which he looked at his tea without drinking it, "There are chains on it." "Old chains?" the foreman asked. "Old," the worker agreed. "Very old, all rusted." He paused again, but one of them, he stopped. "One of what?" "One of the padlocks," the worker said carefully. "It's not rusted. He looked up at the foreman with an expression that was difficult to read, but had something in it of a man who has encountered a fact he wishes he could unlearn. "It's open," he said. "The lock is open." Someone opened one of the padlocks from the inside. The foreman was quiet for a moment. "Or something," he said. "Yes," the worker said, "or something." The gas main was rerouted to avoid the obstruction. The foreman filed no report on the iron door or its state. The excavation records for that section of Galston Street noted only that old foundation materials had been encountered and worked around. In 1953, there were 13 violent deaths in a 3-week period in the Whitechapel area, all of them in circumstances that defied easy explanation. The case files were eventually closed, unsatisfactorily. A small number of investigators who worked them noted, in private communications that were never submitted to any official record, that the victims had been found at locations that described a ring, a rough circle drawn on the map of Whitechapel, with its centre somewhere beneath Galston Street. In 1971, a photographer working on a documentary about Victorian London's underground infrastructure was given limited access to a section of tunnel believed to connect with old Whitechapel drainage works. She descended with a guide and a camera and spent 40 minutes underground before insisting on returning to the surface. She never published any photographs from that session. In an interview given many years later, she said only that she had photographed a door, and that when she developed the film, the photographs were blank, not underexposed, not overexposed, simply white, as though the camera had recorded not darkness, but an absence of everything that darkness normally contains. In 1989, a civil engineer reviewing subterranean survey data for a Whitechapel development project noticed an anomaly in ground-penetrating radar readings below a section of Galston Street. A large void, roughly 50 metres below the surface, its dimensions suggesting an enclosed space considerably larger than any known drainage or utility installation. He requested historical records to see if the void corresponded to any documented structure. No historical records were found. He noted the anomaly in his survey and recommended further investigation. The recommendation was noted, filed, and not acted upon. The development project proceeded, the building was erected, its foundations did not touch the void. Sometimes in the basement of the building, late at night, maintenance workers reported hearing sounds from below the floor. A knocking, regular, patient. 40 years after the events of October 1888, an elderly woman named Constance Aldridge gave a brief interview to a journalist working on a piece about local folklore for a Whitechapel parish magazine. Constance was 81 and had lived in the neighbourhood her entire life. She had been an infant in 1888, had no personal memory of the Ripper murders, but had grown up with the stories, the way children grow up with the stories that the adults around them tell and half-tell and leave deliberately unfinished. What do people say in the neighbourhood, the journalist asked her, about the underground, about what's supposed to be down there? Constance folded her hands in her lap and thought about this for a moment. They say there's a door, she said, an old door sealed up. And what's behind the door? The journalist asked. Constance looked at him with the clear, unfrightened eyes of a woman who had had 81 years to make her peace with unpleasant things. That depends, she said, on which side of it you're asking from. The journalist wrote this down. Some people, Constance continued, they say the door was sealed to keep something out, something that was trying to get in from below, from wherever the dark things come from, and sealing the door was the way to keep it from getting into the world. And the other version, the journalist asked. Constance was quiet for a moment. The other version, she said, is that the door was sealed to keep something in, something that was already here, already in the world, already among us, and the sealing was the way to contain it, to stop it spreading. She looked at the window. Outside, Whitechapel went about its ordinary life in the ordinary autumn afternoon. The people who believe the first version, she said, they sleep easier, because if it's outside and the door is shut, then we are safe inside. And the people who believe the second version, the journalist asked. They don't sleep much at all, Constance said. On the 19th of November 2019, a cold, foggy autumn evening in Whitechapel, a woman walking home from a late shift heard, distinctly, a sound from below the pavement of Galston Street. She stopped, stood still, listened. A knocking sound, regular from below. She looked around her. The street was not empty, there were other pedestrians, and the distant sounds of traffic, and the blur of light from shop windows and phone screens. Nobody else appeared to have heard anything. The knocking continued for perhaps 30 seconds and then stopped. She did not investigate, she did not report it to anyone. She walked home a little faster than usual, And when she arrived, she made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table with both hands around the cup and looked at the wall, and after a while she said, to no one in particular, "Not tonight." And Whitechapel went on, as it had always gone on, the streets above, the dark below, and between them 30 feet of stone and soil and the accumulated weight of centuries, an iron door. Shut, barred, still, for now. But in the deepest part of that same night, when the city's noise had dropped to its minimum, when the few remaining lights showed amber through the fog, when even the hardiest of the street people had found their corners and their doorways, a sound rose from below the pavement of Galston Street. A sound that, if you stood in exactly the right spot at exactly the right moment and pressed your ear hypothetically to the wet stone of the street, you might have heard. A mechanism working, metal against metal, the sound of something old and resistant and patient beginning to turn. The sound, if you were the sort of person who knew what that sound meant, of a lock working from the inside. Unlocking. Slowly. With all the time in the world. Some doors are locked to keep evil out *, and others are locked to keep it in.